Have you ever finished a day of back-to-back meetings and realize you just spent the whole thing reacting? You're never quite present, never quite yourself, just running from call to call until by mid-afternoon, you're just running on fumes. For an introverted leader, this isn't just a scheduling problem. We consistently miss opportunities to intervene in that gap between stimulus and response. So, mindfulness at work is about building awareness of that gap one moment at a time. My guest today has spent 20 years doing exactly this, from war zones to call centers to sitting in front of classrooms, and she's clear-eyed about what it looks like when you approach your contemplative practice not as a life hack, but as the ground your leadership stands on. Welcome to The Introverted Leader. It's a podcast helping introverted leaders embrace your underrated, quiet strengths so you can get promoted and start earning what you deserve. I'm Gregweinger. I have over 25 years of leadership experience, and yes, I am an introvert. My guest today is Lindsey Cameron. She's a management professor, longtime meditator, and a researcher whose work on labor, technology, and mindfulness gives her a unique perspective on what actually sustains quiet leaders in a system built for noise. Also, before we start, I want to share something with you. I made a free masterclass just for introverted leaders. It's called Why Everything You've Been Told About Getting Ahead as an Introvert is Wrong. 30 minutes, 3 moments that decide whether you stay or advance in your career, and 1 practice you can start today. I'm also hosting a series of live leadership labs monthly, all free. Get started at gregweinger.com/masterclass. That's GWEINGER.com/masterclass, one word. All right, let's get into it. All right, welcome to the show, Lindsey. So great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Just to kick us off, do you consider yourself an introvert, extrovert, or other?
Oh God, I'm an introvert who pretends to be an extrovert and then runs home and takes naps.
All right, no one's any the wiser, huh?
Right. Yeah, I think hopefully. Some my partner, they definitely know.
Yeah, people who know you best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, have suspicions. You have just a remarkable background. You started off in intelligence, as I understand it, doing counterterrorism work, including overseas. What you talk about publicly is you have a contemplative practice. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that, where that began, and how that supports you.
Oh goodness, it's even hard to know how it began because I certainly wasn't raised with a contemplative practice at
Mm-hmm.
all. It's something I came to when I was actually at this boarding school, the Texas Academy of Math and Science. And that is started the beginning inkling. And then I think when I went away to college, then it went deeper. And then spending time in war zones, there were all these signs on the wall. It said, stressed out. Well, of course you're stressed out. You're in Baghdad. Come to this sitting circle or come to this knitting group or whatever. So this became like my little after dinner. Everybody would have like an hour-long break where you go to the gym or you do some activity. And that's how I ended up starting being involved in meditation. I think I learned from reading the back of yoga journal magazines. And as soon as I came back to America is when I started doing these sort of longer intensive retreats, 3, 5, 10, 14-day retreats. And I mean, it's been part of my life now for more than 20 years.
Yeah, so you must have had some success with it, but in the war zone as well. I guess if you had to compare what you were able to apply then compared to, how your practice grew.
Well, I think for meditation, it can meet you where you at. And I would say for the early years, it was all about emotional regulation. How do you create a bigger gap between the stimulus and the response? Viktor Frankl and so many other people have talked about it. I spent a lot of time with people who had lived in ashrams and who have dedicated their lives to this. And the way that it shapes my life right now, it's like embodied in everything I do. I have a sign on my desk that says work is a form of worship. And so there's a thought like if you bring a meditative quality to your interactions with people, it's your life. So it's hard to explain how does it support your life because that
Mm.
assumes that there's like an other from it.
So there's this idea where I think most people start out with mindfulness and meditation as for lack of a better word, a life hack. It's something that's supporting you, making a situation better, more tolerable, and it's really effective. It works for that. If you spend more time in it, then a next step, a next stage, it's kind of a more constant moment-to-moment thing throughout the day, and you can connect it at a deeper level.
Right.
And when you were describing that, it's kind of echoes my experience.
The study I did with the call centers was about how to create a mindful moment. So it'd be before the person is answering the call, because the calls are coming on the line, ring, ring, ring. They would take 3 breaths before answering the call. And it could be the same way when you're walking in and out of a room. I remember talking to an acupuncturist that saw their word as being the needle, their words being just as important as whatever medical tool they were using. It was Bob Duggan, I remember his name now. He runs an acupuncture school in Maryland. When he would put his hand on the doorknob, for him that would be his mindful moment before he came into the room. You know, for me, I tend to do very long sadhanas. So sadhana is like a daily practice. So every morning, probably today was like 35 minutes, I'll do a meditation, and I do the same meditation maybe every day for 3 months, 6 months, however long that is the prescription for that particular type of meditation that I'm working toward. But there are all these different ways to integrate it into one's life. Some people pray the rosary. Some people, it's their mindful moment as they read their stories to their children as they're going to bed for bedtime. So the moment can be different, but there is a point, I feel like, in most people's practice where you move from it from being like more of a psychological tool, like emotional regulation, to more of this part of this sort of integrated sense of wellness and being.
I want to get into some of your non-mindfulness research. I'm curious, what are some of the cross currents as it applies to introverts or leadership? One of the big areas, as I understand, is you studied ride-sharing programs. There was a personal connection there too. What did you observe during that time that piqued your interest, that motivated your research?
You know, my mother lost her job in the Great Recession. She did a lot of what one would consider like low-end service jobs. She sold samples in grocery stores, and she worked at a warehouse at night stocking, and she sold purses at the Trademark. But she very much the entire time considered herself middle class and carried herself middle class, dressed that way, had a lot of personal respect and dignity. And she was earning less than what I earned in graduate school on a stipend, which wasn't much. And so I was very interested in downward social mobility and how do people try to stop it. Because so much of our society, American society, is focused on upwards ability. There are all these rags to riches story, which is a belief in the American dream and is very powerful, but as often doesn't actually match what's happening economically in the United States right now. I was talking to people who were going through massive layoffs or downsizing. It was in the early 2010s. Many people were driving for Uber as a tool to not fall deeper into poverty. And that's, you know, became, I just sort of centered on like, what is this company and how is it transforming labor? I think there's a lot of great things that Uber does. There's also some challenging things around its business model. That's one of the reasons I love it, is because you never know. It's not like with mindfulness where like I knew what I wanted the right answer to be. There is no right answer for Uber. And it's not even just Uber, it's everything in the gig economy and how much it's transformed the way we think about work.
And is it right you tried driving for Uber yourself?
I
Better understand
did.
that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did work part-time as a driver over the course of 3 years. I had research assistants drive for me because I'm a woman driving in one city, and I had them drive in a different city, and he was a guy, so he had a different experience. And then, you know, I've been interviewing drivers probably in like 8, 9 countries over the past 10 years. I've been studying it. So I feel like I know not just Uber, I'm using Uber as a shorthand, but like Lyft, DoorDash, TaskRabbit, all those companies, I feel like I know them very well.
Yeah, and what would you say are the unique characteristics? I mean, part of what I saw is you're hired, managed, and fired by an algorithm. It's like you don't actually speak to human beings at these companies.
Well, if you're an introvert that doesn't want to talk to people, I know that's a bad stereotype.
Yeah, that doesn't sound bad. You mean I don't have to talk to a boss? That's great.
I know that's one of the appeals of this company. I think that's also one of the challenging things too, because you can't ask leniency from an algorithm in the same way you can ask for leniency from your boss.
Yeah.
But you know, the core thing that's different about them is they replace managers with algorithms, and that's, I think we're seeing that now with the more of AI is being rolled out, and we're having to have people involved in testing these new technologies. And, can you stump the bot or can you stump the LLM? I mean, often those people are employed in gig, like these are short term, technically managed jobs. It's like gig work, the new generation of gig work. So I'd say that's one of the major parts is technology management. Another one is having customers doing the rating. It's a way to outsource management, so it's not done, at least it doesn't look like it's done by the company. It's done by you, the consumer. I mean, it's just, they are rewriting the rules of the game.
I want to talk about your paper, The Good Bad Job. It sounds like you're looking at what this is doing psychologically to someone who's working here, where you feel like, I have all this choice, I have all this freedom, I can work whenever I want. What's the illusion there?
Well, we think it's so great to work from home. There's a lot of research that says introverts, people of color, women, LGBT people prefer to work at home because they are less likely to face microaggressions and discrimination. And when you look at who often is considered for promotions, it's usually the people who put in more face time, who develop these sort of more rich, sticky relationships. And particularly earlier in your career, that those things are really important because you're trying to build your network. So I think I sort of bring up that example because when you think about gig work, there are ways where people do have a fair amount of schedule flexibility and can sort of like expand or contract their earnings up to a given amount of what they want to earn. And there are ways when you're in a system where you don't understand the rules that are being presented to you. You don't understand the commission or how you're being assigned different tasks in the system or how are you visible. So there's a way of which it might feel good in the short term, which is what this paper is talking about. That's the good part, the good bad job. But the bad part is you're embedded in this bigger system where there are repercussions for being part of it. And so in the same way that I sort of say gig work can be the good bad job, it's the way you could also think about remote work. Like good, yes, perhaps psychologically for you in the short term, it's hard to think about what are the consequences 2 to 3 years down the line.
Right. You're not establishing those networks that could further propel your career to really expand.
Yeah, you cannot do the same amount of learning on a job, particularly if you're early in your career, if you're in remote, unless this is a remote first organization that's been designed explicitly for that. But most people are being plopped into remote jobs without that sort of infrastructure. And I think as an introvert, that's an especially hard challenge that people might have, particularly if you're going to have to learn how to be more ambidextrous with your introvertedness if you don't get that practice early on.
Yeah, it becomes in a way kind of like a dead end job. Like there's only so far you can rise or grow in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I'm actually writing a paper on the gig economy right now. Like, it's like a job where there is no growth. What is the real growth if you're still doing ride hailing work 10 to 12 years in the
Right.
future versus those who are able to sort of pivot and able to sort of build out some entrepreneurial skill sets? Because while that is a smaller percentage of people, it is real and it does happen. So it's one of the things that I've been looking at recently.
Yeah, it seems like even just like ride sharing that you have an opportunity to develop social skills that you wouldn't sitting alone with a computer necessarily.
I did interview somebody once who was a doctor at a big fancy hospital. I can't say which one. And I was like, so you drive for Uber? Why do you drive for Uber? He's like, because my evals at the hospital said I had poor bedside manner. And so I'm trying to improve upon this. And I mean, I say it because it's a good story and it's true. It's definitely a minority reason for why people are on the app, but
Yeah,
it happens.
yeah. Hats off to him for creativity on that.
Right. And some people just love to drive.
Yeah, people coming to you. I always thought that as an introvert, the best way to be at a party was to be the host because you have a role. And then I was never nervous. I had no social anxiety. Like, you're in my house. I have a real job there.
And you have a reason to flit from person to person. And I think at the same time, I also love hosting events. It's like I belong because I created this group.
There's no question. I belong here. This is my house.
Right.
Going back to mindfulness practice, is it true to say that you've worked in Vipassana and non-dual traditions?
Yes, yes. Tantric traditions, Vipassana in Buddhism. We talked about Tibetan earlier. And then I'm part of an indigenous African community as well. I've recently
That's
started
cool.
learning about Celtic traditions, which my ancestry that is non black is pretty far away. I think it's more from the 1800s. But those are all the different ancestral strands that bring that back through that work through me. And what I particularly appreciate about Tantric or Tibetan traditions is they're Eastern, but there is a strong connection to ancestors and to land.
Hmm.
So, there's an interesting book that I read. I think it's called Why We Need More Than One Religion. And I don't know if I want to go as far to say do I need more than one religion? I think I don't have the answer to that. But it's more about respecting and honoring all the different cosmopolitans of energies and beliefs that shape who we are today. When we're talking about mindfulness, that's a very Eastern practice that's here in the West. And there's a way it's been deeply decontextualized here in the West. And you could go back and forth. Well, maybe it had to be decontextualized because most of us are householders, and we have, there's a lot more divorcing and splitting we have from family and ancestors and land than what people might have had in more Eastern places. I say that I do have a core practice, but I would say like I'm just like I have a keen interest in life and a lot of different practices that try to explain the human experience.
We talked earlier about building a refuge for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
something that's genuinely yours, and how that could be helpful in life and workplace situations. So I was wondering, what does that look like for you personally?
Hmm. It's keeping the community of people around me that are close to me. I have all these little crews, I have like my workout crew, I have my meditation crew, I have my gardening crew, and to keep them close no matter what. I had a teacher once say to me, you leave high school and you feel like you belong and you matter, or you spend the rest of your life searching for it. And so you create the community of peoples that you belong and that you matter to. Because, your work, you can love your work. Your work likely will not love you back. At least all the time, it's not going to love you back. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to have other communities that are this buttress, this support. So that's one of the things I have. I go away on retreat a lot, 4 times a year, 5 times a year. And so they're usually with one of these little groups, or I'm organizing a group of people together. And that's a big sense of support for me as well.
That's great. And if you're doing 10-day retreats somewhere like that, that really adds up to a lot of quality time with those folks.
Because one of the hardest things in your adult life is to make new friends. I mean, there's something, is it like 200 or 3 hours you need to convert someone from an acquaintance to like the first level of friendship? I'm not sure the right number, but I know Shasta Nelson has written a lot about this.
Hmm.
I think her book is called Friendships Don't Just Happen.
Mhm.
And so this is one of the ways to get in quality time with people to develop a relationship, which is an introvert doesn't like. It's often in building these small, slow build communities.
Yeah, so it's the communities and the activities that allow you to establish these deeper friendships, which is always probably a challenge as an introvert, but it gets increasingly more challenging the older you get. You get settled, your job doesn't turn over, or you see a limited number of people at your work, or like you said, they don't love you back. So you're looking for something a little bit more stable.
That's true. That's true. And you're like, I could just stay at home at night and watch Netflix. It's one of the downsides with some of those technologies. They make it so you don't need human contact. In the same way with DoorDash. I remember when they moved to these sort of contactless deliveries. So yeah, it can take effort to sustain relationships. But in addition to these communities, there's a practice it's called art. I think it's the I'd have to see. I think it's called the art of living relationships or something like that. I could find the name. But they run circle groups all across the world actually. And it's about how can you have meaningful conversation with people in a very short period of time. So there's a lot of exercises and games about how do you see someone and how do you reflect that back to them. And so that's something I've actually done in the last few cities that I've lived in is I've been part of these art communication groups, and some people become friends, and some people don't become friends from the group, but what it teaches you is a new way to connect and talk to people that's beyond, oh, isn't it cold outside today? Oh, that looks like a good sandwich you're eating.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely share the link with that. That sounds interesting to share with the audience. It sounds a little bit like speed dating for a friendship, which I think we could use.
Yeah, in the communities I've been with, there have been like workshops. It can be 1 hour to up to 3 or 4. Sometimes they do like date treats and things like that. And it's not so much about making friends, like you could make friends. It's
Mm-hmm.
more about having intimate moments with people. It's probably the easiest way to describe it. It's like a form of deep relating.
Yeah, or building that capacity to have deep, more intimacy with people.
Perfect. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it. It's building the capacity for deep intimacy. And I
yeah,
mean, that's ultimately what we all long for, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, I had one other question for you. Um, Energy management. I'm curious if you find yourself as an introvert, like how important that is and what advice you might have for other people who maybe feel drained by being out in front and teaching as a leader. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a work in progress, so I think I need to listen to all your listeners and see what they're going to say. I feel very fortunate that I have a door in an office and I can work from home.
Hmm.
But teaching is definitely high energy. It's 6, 8 hours. You're in front of groups of people. But I have a daily rest practice, and that's in addition to the meditation that I do every morning. And then my rest group, we get together for 2 hours once a week, and it's in the middle of a work day. So, and you talk about a rewiring of your brain to
Hmm.
have a 2 hour rest practice in the middle of a day. So those are some of the things in the way they're integrated in my life. I usually walk, sometimes I ride my bike to and from work, but I never listen to podcasts. I never listen to music. I'm fully in the moment of the walking, and for me that's the clearing, that's the energy management.
Hmm.
So I know for some people this would be listening to something, but I really like to have no input. And so often when I go home, the only thing that might be playing might be mantras, so something that's very repetitive and very quiet. My house turns into all red light once the sun comes down.
That's
So
cool.
I just have a lot of lamps that have two bulbs, the white bulb and the red bulb.
Hmm.
So there are these ways that I do, like almost like endogenous energy management, or like ways where I replenish myself through my daily practices.
That's fantastic. And tell me more about the rest group. Is it? Sounds like another one of your
My
your
activities.
your groups, but you all get together and rest.
We do. We do.
That's so cool.
One of my friends said this is a very male thing that you have all these friends that are like grouped around activities. I was like, I didn't know that was a male way to have relationships. But yes, we are a rest group. And yeah, we rest together every week for 2 hours.
You got like pillows, or you can,
I mean, you do build a rest nest. Some people have pillows and blankets. I have like a chair in my office. In the 2 hours, people take turns in leading whatever is going to be facilitated. So it could be that there's a meditation practice. It could be that you're listening to music for the period of time and then maybe you're talking a bit toward the end. It could be you're being read to. I hadn't been read to since I was probably 5. It is so soothing.
hmm
Now I know why they do it in all these Victorian novels. They talk about hiring the young girl to come read to the older woman. Sometimes it's a lecture talking about the science behind rest and how your nervous system can become overwhelmed and how people that are from some sort of marginalized background carry more stress in them. And so how you might be predisposed to actually overwork because you have this sort of heightened level of stress in you. So it varies whatever the practice is, but yeah, it's an entrainment. It's becomes entrained because it becomes part of your life and how do you live.
Yeah. And is this on like a Zoom kind of group, or
Yeah,
is it?
it's
Yeah.
Zoom. We get
Yeah.
together for an in-person retreat once a year, and then everything else is Zoom.
All right. Well, this is a great. Honestly, I wasn't expecting any of these answers. These are fantastic, practical advice.
We're all trying. We're all doing our little piece to make it here on Earth and to leave
Yeah.
Earth a little bit better than when we came in.
Yeah, with a little support and yeah, I think we tend to be, more keyed up naturally. I think that's partly why
Yeah.
we like quiet. We're
Hmm.
already, our minds are, nervous systems are stimulated, and so I
Hmm.
find more and more different practices to help regulate and throughout the day keep me on an even keel.
Another practice I have is I do tea ceremony maybe 2 or 3 times a week. There's a whole science. A lot of Eastern cultures have tea as their meditative practice.
Mhm.
My best friend is Chinese. She's also really into tea, so I've learned a lot from her. I've gone on retreats with her where we've learned. After some mornings, after I do my regular sit, I use tea that are like actual tea leaves, not like bags of tea.
Hmm.
And there's a ritual around having the table set, having a flower, having some soft music playing, having sometimes you can have a candle or a scent. And in the way that you pour the tea in the bowl, you go in a clockwise setting. There's the ritual and repetitiveness of it. And so I do it at a small scale at my office because I do have a teapot, glass, it sits on its own
Yeah.
burner. The tea is usually somehow linked to whatever the season is because teas have a lot of medicinal properties. But at home, I do a more elaborate tea ritual. As I'm saying, these are practices that are part of my everyday life.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So this has been such a pleasure. If the people in the audience want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
Just Google my name, Lindsey Cameron. It'll come right up.
All right. Check out the papers
Yeah,
and
right. We
yeah,
covered everything today from labor to tea.
yeah, and everything in between.
Right.
All right. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's nice to connect with a fellow introvert.
Yeah, likewise. Okay, there are three things I'm taking away from this conversation. Number one, mindfulness at work is not an escape. It lives in the small gaps, those small moments you build into your day. 3 breaths before you answer a call. Your hand on the doorknob before you walk into a room. That tiny pause is what turns your reactivity into presence, and over time, it quietly transforms the quality of your leadership. Number two, there's a shift that happens eventually in any practice if you continue, where mindfulness stops being a mere tool to manage stress, and it starts to define the way you move through the world. Lindsey has a sign on her desk that says, "Work is a form of worship." It's a great takeaway. The goal is to bring that quality of mind, of presence that you might have in meditation to any meeting room that you enter, any work conversation. And number three, this is a great insight from Lindsey. Your work is not going to love you back. Not all the time and not in the ways that you need. So you need a refuge of sorts, a small community, rest group, a tea ritual. Whatever that is for you, build it and keep it close because that's what keeps you going and sustained as a leader. If you enjoyed this content, here's one clear next step. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the easiest way to make sure the next one lands in your feed, and it helps other introverted leaders find this content. I'm Greg Weinger. Keep leading with quiet confidence, and I'll see you next time.